Hello, everybody. I am here today with Clare Daly, who is currently a member of the European Parliament, representing the Irish constituency of Dublin in Brussels since 2019. Before that, Ms. Daly was a member of the Irish Parliament for 4 years. Ms. Daly has been active in politics ever since her student days in the 1980s. She was a member of the Labour Party and other left-wing parties after that. On the EU level, she's part of the left in the European Parliament. She recently spoke out forcefully against escalatory measures in the Russo-Ukrainian war, something that I originally thought would be the position of any of the lefties in Europe. But I was unfortunately disappointed when I saw how many on the left are not in support of diplomatic solutions. That's what we want to discuss today. So, Ms. Daly, thank you very much for taking the time.
Not at all. The pleasure is all mine. Thanks for having me on.
Ms. Daly, we are living in very, very charged moments, like when what people think what reality is determines very much their actions, their political actions that they prefer. And I would like to hear from you, first of all, how do you interpret the Russo-Ukrainian war? What do you think is going on and who is to blame for it?
Yeah, I mean, look, ultimately, and first off, Russia are responsible. They invaded the sovereign territory of Ukraine. I don't believe that they didn't have other options. I think the door for a solution in terms of, particularly maybe through the role of France and Germany, could have been exploited more. But while saying that, for anybody to ignore the role of NATO and the US behind the scenes in destabilizing Ukraine over the past since 2014 and the Maidan coup and so on, for anybody not to see that as a contributing factor would be utterly naive as well. And for me now, we have the tragedy where Ukraine is being used in a US-Russia conflict, really, which has been fought out on the terrain of Ukraine. And unfortunately, with the complicity of the leadership in power in Ukraine at the moment, and the victims of that are first and foremost the people of Ukraine, but ultimately the people of Russia and of increasingly of Europe as well.
And in the European Parliament, you held this very forceful speech something that I haven't heard very much, against sending more weapons to Ukraine and for other routes of trying to bring the war to an end. So what kind of other routes do you see? What's available?
Well, it's incredible. And I do think your point about perception is very valid, because we have to see that the war is taking place against the backdrop of unprecedented propaganda. And I mean, we talk about truth being the first casualty of war. Well, my God, I really understand the meaning of that slogan now, because it's very hard to get accurate information. And if anybody raises their head against the official narrative and doesn't go, you know, we stand with Ukraine, if you try and see the nuances behind the cause of the conflict, you're immediately demonized as a sort of a Putin puppet or something like that. But the facts of the matter, when we look at it clinically without that hysteria, is that sending arms into a conflict, and it's actually illegal under EU treaties. This is the first time it's ever happened. You don't need to be a genius to work out that it's going to prolong the conflict. It absolutely is, and the casualties of that will be Ukrainians, Russians, and instability. It's not helping Ukraine. And people have said to me, oh, that's ridiculous. You know, are you saying if you see a fella, you know, being beaten up, are you just going to, you know, allow that to happen? And I'm going to say, but if you see a small guy getting beaten up by a big guy, I don't say, here's a stick, now keep beating him until you kill him or you get killed yourself. I break up the fight. And that's what the international community should have done diplomatically, because more weapons mean a longer war. There's never been a war in history that hasn't had war crimes, that innocent people haven't been affected. That's the consequence of it. And the other really scary bit is the fact that sending wholesale weapons into Ukraine, which are literally almost being collected on the streets, they're being handed out without any account being taken of whose hands they're going into. They're picking up weapons on the streets. those weapons are going to end up back in Europe, and they will be used in the future as well. The proliferation of weapons is scary, to be honest with you. So that was the reasons why it doesn't help, you know, and it just makes the situation worse.
Thank you so much for that. I agree, and I keep wondering, when did ever more weapons lead to less dying? But that seems to be something that currently is being thought about in Europe, and I wonder where that is coming from. So you who are sitting in the European Parliament, how many people do you think are supporting this side of yours that says not more weapons but more diplomacy will lead to an end of the conflict?
Oh, I'd say out of about 705 MEPs, if there were 50, I would be very surprised. But you're talking about figures in and around the 50 mark. So I can't do my mathematical calculations, but a very small minority. And to be honest, those like me who raise our heads on this issue are demonized and vilified amongst the political groups in the parliament, in the media in our own countries, because this propaganda assault has been prepared for years. Every European country has NATO-sponsored think tanks. We have the National Endowment of Democracy paying for much of the media in a lot of the outlets, and they are on message that anybody doesn't give the narrative is to be immediately demonized. And so therefore the support in the European Chamber is low. But I think people should realize that actually globally there are a lot of people who are thinking differently. So obviously we've been the subject of serious hate mail and vitriolic, horrible stuff, but there's a huge amount of people out there who see things differently across Ireland, but internationally as well. I mean, in some ways you could say the fact that I gave a speech just basically saying that the solution to war is not more war, it's peace, which would sound true, but, you know, basically correct, but actually the establishment and the message going out there is the opposite. But the amount of people, I was contacted by people on every planet, in the United States, in Australia, in Russia, in Ukraine, I mean, every part of Europe, huge numbers in Italy and Germany, interestingly, large numbers of people all over the world just saying, oh my God, I thought I was the mad one. I haven't heard people saying this, and I thought that was me. And why isn't there more people saying that? And I think there is loads of people saying it. It's just they're in the class of people whose voices are not being heard by the political establishments globally, because it's not in their interest, because the continuation of the war is in the interests of big business, really. And I mean, you know, at first when the war started, we were saying, oh, there has to be peace. And they'd say, oh, that's ridiculous. Of course, we're all fighting for peace. We all want to do that, but you can't leave these defenseless Ukrainians. Now they don't even say that. Now the US and the EU are on record of saying, yes, we want peace, but we want Russia to be inflicted first. You know, we don't want peace at any terms. We want Russia to take a hammering. Now, when I say I want the war to finish, it's not that I'm a Putin puppet. It's just that I don't believe the price of punishing Russia is worth the blood and the destruction of Ukraine and the destruction of the living standards of Europeans and ultimately of ordinary Russian citizens. I think that's a price too high to pay. I think it would be far better if we sat down and negotiated issues with Russia. And yes, that does mean compromise. But the officials in US and in EU have decided now that this war will be settled by force. They're negotiating for, I suppose, their places at the table. Both Russia and Ukraine are doing that as well. They don't want to stop the war either for their own reasons, to get a better negotiating position. And the sad and tragic part of all of that is that it's ordinary people across Europe, including Russia, who are going to pay the price of that.
And the working class that's being slaughtered on the battlefields. Let's not forget that it's on both sides, those people. But the your voice is being heard, which is good, even also in the US, the real left in the United States, and just also on the propaganda issue. I talked yesterday to former US Ambassador Chas Freeman, who's born 1940, and he says not even the McCarthy era was as ideologically charged as the current era is. So that is quite something. So I hope you will continue this. But I keep also wondering, is the perception that you're having and the position you're having, does it also stem from coming from Ireland? Does it also stem from being from a neutral country? Does this neutrality issue of Ireland play any role in that, or nothing at all?
Well, I would like to think that it does, in that my politics, and I was actually 8 years in the Irish Parliament, not 4, but anyway, no, it's okay. But like, comes from our anti-colonial past, from our cherished neutrality, which has always been under attack by our ruling elites, if you like. They've never wanted it. There's always been a coterie of people who have believed that the strong anti-militarist voice, that Eurosceptic kind of voice, anti-neoliberal, that Ireland has always returned. There's been a group of strong Europhiles in Ireland who think that's an embarrassment to Ireland, that we should be the best Europeans. And I have to be honest with you, the onslaught on myself and my colleague Mick Wallace in the Irish media is of an unprecedented scale. And every bit of it is that we are an embarrassment and a disgrace. The next election cannot come quick enough to get us out. We should resign our seats now. And I mean, all we've done is had the same anti-imperialist, pro-peace, pro-neutrality position that we had in the Irish Parliament. And this just shows the power of propaganda unleashed. And if you repeat something often enough, that it has an impact. So I do think my position in defence of neutrality shapes my political view. But I wouldn't want you to think that, you know, we're getting loads of praise in Ireland for this, because we're getting absolutely and utterly hammered in Ireland for this. But there is strong groups of people who've got in contact as well who say, oh my God, I don't know how you stand what's going on to you. We don't understand it either, because it's so disproportionate to what you're actually, and unrelated to what you're actually saying, but keep doing what you're doing. We appreciate it. We want our neutrality kept. And interestingly, there was an opinion poll done. I think the establishment were really shocked about this, because the, you know, anti-Russian and the pro-militarist response, which the EU have been drumming up, has been day and night in Ireland. And yet 66% of people in the last 2 weeks voted that we should keep our neutrality. So that's brilliant. And it shocked the establishment, actually. And I wouldn't be complacent about it. I don't think it's in the bag or anything like that, because what they're saying now is we need a conversation about it. We need to be part of a common defence. We need to stand by our colleagues in Europe and our European values, whatever they are, because Russia's part of Europe as well, you know. So look, it's complicated. I suppose that's where I come from, is defence of neutrality. I do think it's precious for Irish people because of our anti-colonial past, but the powers that be have always wanted it gone. In European treaties, it's the people who forced concessions in defence of our neutrality up against the political establishment. But the war and Putin's action has unfortunately given them a lease of life now and a chance to attack neutrality in a way in which they never thought they'd have it before.
Where is the defense of neutrality coming from? Because like Sweden and Finland, unfortunately, seem to be on a straight path to NATO membership, which I think is highly unfortunate and hugely instabilizing for the entire European continent. This cannot help the security structure. And in Switzerland and Austria, what we are seeing is that the center is basically attacking it, and also the left, in fact. The defense, at least in Switzerland, of neutrality is coming from the right. How about Ireland?
No, it would be the opposite. Like that, it is being attacked and it is being undermined, have no doubt. Obviously, ably supported by the NATO think tanks that locate everywhere, and by the ruling parties in Ireland, who are just, Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael. They're the right-wing parties that have predominated. They're currently in coalition government together. The main opposition in Ireland is Sinn Féin, who would be a radical nationalist party. They would be portrayed as being on the left. Their voters would be largely of the left. they're seen as new and untarnished. Their membership would see themselves as left wing, you know, a lot of them. And certainly a lot of their voters would as well. So they've been a little bit disappointing. They were okay on the issue for a while and they support neutrality openly now. On the war, under pressure from the onslaught in the media, they've kind of been very much, I think, disproportionate, trying to, I suppose, make up for, you know, they've been ultra critical of Russia, and fair enough, like, do you know what I mean? But in a disproportionate way, I think. So the attack is very much coming from the political establishment who've wanted it gone for years, because even though it's in place, Ireland's leadership have been actively undermining that for years. I mean, when we were in the Irish Parliament, we had hundreds of questions challenging the fact that on a daily basis, the US military use our civilian airports in the west of Ireland. That is not allowed by a neutral country. And they say, oh, but we have a gentleman's agreement. They don't carry any weapons or anything like that, or anything like that. They've given us an undertaking, and we said, well, you should be searching them. And we actually broke in to the airport when we were in the Irish Parliament to search them, but we didn't get near the plane. We got arrested before that. But we had a 3-day trial in court, which put the US military really on trial, and it was very successful for educating the public. So there has been that long, I suppose, activist tradition there in protecting our neutrality, but the establishment have always undermined and be clever. They said, oh, we're militarily neutral, but we're not neutral. You know, we like our, you know, we obviously put ourselves in the camp of our Atlantic friends. They kowtow to foreign direct investment from the US and so on. But they've never been as slavishly one-sided as they are now. I mean, they're on the UN Security Council now. Can you imagine if Ireland had taken a different role in this? If they said, listen, we're a small neutral country. We're firmly in the camp of the West. We love America. We can't do enough for them. But we're an anti-colonial country ourselves, and we've been the victims of this, and we understand what it's like. We want to reach out and argue for peace. For everybody, sit down around the table. We had to negotiate with our powerful next door neighbour who occupied us for years and interfered with our country. But at the end of the day, we sat down with them and we made a peace deal, and the international community had our backs in that peace deal, enabling it to happen. Why can't you do it in this? And of course, the reason why they can't is it's too much of an opportunity for the US and NATO now to keep this war going. And sadly, Europe has allowed itself be used in this, because Europe's going to be, and the EU is going to pay a huge price in this as well. Apart from, and you're totally right, the biggest price being paid by anybody in this, of course, is the people of Ukraine and Ukraine itself.
The next question is a pure guesswork probably, but when you look at how the negotiations between Russia and Ukraine have been going, about 3 weeks ago, a neutral Ukraine was, I would say, in reach, and then it kind of went sour, very sour. Do you think that a neutral Ukraine is still a possible outcome of this? Do you see a possibility of it? And do you think it is rather the Russian side, the Ukrainian side, or the NATO-US side that's torpedoing this outcome?
I think they all are in many ways. I mean, a neutral Ukraine, there will always have to be neutral Ukraine. But I suppose the sad thing now is that the people of Ukraine were strongly in favor of a position of neutrality. And it has been the political interference over the past period ratcheting up a conflict that has undermined the basis of its neutrality. And look where it has led to. It has led to the potential breakup of the country. Certainly, if it's to regain its sovereignty in a post-war era, its rebuilding is going to be absolutely massive. But I mean, NATO itself knows it's never going to accept Ukraine into membership. Ukraine has to be neutral, really, for its own survival. But it's less likely now, because now the camps are there. Now there's an active war on. And, you know, when those talks in March were looking at that as a solution, that was when the US and the EU went in and started sending in extra weapons and sending a message that the forceful fight would continue, undermining that message. So it's harder now to see a neutral Ukraine. I think it will be neutral, but I think the cost of it being neutral now is going to be absolutely astronomical in the sense of the continuation of this war now for a whole period of time. Possibly, I mean, we have the scary scenario outlined by Hillary Clinton of, and this could be an Afghanistan for Russia, but that looks like a prolonged conflict or a prolonged kind of North-South Korea sort of border of militarist border been in existence for years. Looks like the scenario we're going into. You couldn't even, I don't think NATO will get directly involved, but you wouldn't rule it out in some more direct format than they have already. And it looks like now this war is going to go on, and that is just scary. So clearly then a neutral Ukraine is less likely now, but ultimately it will have to be in one format or another.
Yeah, it's either neutrality, it's either permanent neutrality or permanent division and permanent war. But Russia, interestingly enough, even in December, has gone straight over the head of the Europeans and only wants to negotiate with NATO and with Washington, and is not perceiving the EU as a geopolitical actor. Do you think that the EU, the Commission, you, the Parliament, if there was a common vision of how to bring about peace, would there be a role for the EU to actually help in this situation, or is this also kind of a in no man's land?
Well, it definitely would have been. That sort of door is very firmly shut at the moment. I never thought I'd say it, but the best person in this has been Macron in France, which, given that ideologically I've always found him absolutely awful, that'll just tell you how bad the rest of them are. Look, and I also don't think, and again, I'd have huge political disagreements, I do not think this war would have happened if Merkel was still in power in Germany. I firmly believe it would not have happened, that she would have had the strength of character and understanding of geopolitical relations on the continent of Europe to prevent it happening, because it's materially not in the interests of Germany to have this war happening, and certainly economically it's not in their interests either. So I think it was the weakness of the new German government in that as well. I mean, right up until the last minute there were some talks going on, the French, Schulz a little bit trying, you know, to sort things out. That's why I think Russia shouldn't have moved. I think there was still room to be explored there, but Russia, I suppose, fell for the bait and have to take responsibility now for being responsible for moving all of that firmly out the door. Militarism has won in the short term. Germany now is committed to another 100 billion in its army, military expenditure going up. The moderate European countries have been driven into the hands of the anti-Russian Baltic states and ultra right-wing nationalist countries. You know, it's laughable. Like a couple of months ago, Poland were the pariah of the EU. You know, all the liberals in the West couldn't stand them. They were the renegades. Now they're the best boys and girls in the European class. It's just everything. Reality has been stood on its head in this conflict. So I think Europe has been really disappointing. It's shot itself in the foot. But maybe the severity of the economic crisis which is coming and which is going to inflict working class people all over, there must be some far-sighted, even capitalists in Germany and France, who kind of say, God almighty, we are shooting ourselves in our European feet here. We're going to go into free fall if this continues. Like, I mean, we've had a 5th row of sanctions. Now they're talking about a 6th one. If they ban oil and gas and all of that thing, like, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of job losses across Germany and so on. So maybe out of an economic crisis, some of them will see sense. But the European Union as a bloc has disgraced itself. The High Representative Joseph Borrell is a thundering disgrace as far as I'm concerned. He has openly said, yeah, he wants peace, but not now. Not until Russia are defeated a bit more or come to the table humbled more. He's not prepared to see that. Well, he's not the one out there fighting. So they could have, they forfeited. And, you know, there's a real irony as well. I mean, I suppose there's so many things here that could be analysed. I mean, for years, the block to an EU army was the UK, because the UK are such an advocate for NATO and they love NATO and they weren't allowing that. Now they're gone, and now NATO has never been stronger inside the EU. I mean, just everything has gone completely mad. So they talk about national sovereignty and defending Ukraine's sovereignty, but yet countries like Ireland aren't supposed to have a sovereignty or a different view or neutrality. We all have to be the same in Europe. So language and reality has just been stood on its head here. But I mean, I'm rambling from your question, which was, could Europe play that role? Not now, but they could have. And maybe some people who've got to be there in Europe see and sense go, whoa. But sadly, that's not going to happen in the short term. The commissioner disgrace, it's not going to come from the EU, maybe from France or Germany, maybe Italy. Not now, they're not in that space now, but maybe they will be. But yeah, it's not good.
Very last question, but one that I'm very conflicted about, because on the one hand, we have NATO, which now shows a lot of capacity for, well, rallying forces and pushing into one direction. A counter proposal comes from the people like Macron, who say, like, Europe needs its own army. Would you support that, or would you think, no, this is not a way either to go?
Oh, absolutely not. No, the only solution is demilitarization. Like, for me, the EU has revealed itself as being completely and utterly captured by the military-industrial complex. And I mean, when I joined the European Parliament in 2019, the Russia-phobia, the anti-Chinese rhetoric, which has been ongoing since we came, I've never seen the like of it. And you see, you can't have an arms industry if you don't have an enemy. And Russia has given them that enemy now. Even they were being teed up to be the enemy, but now they've actually, by their action, in reality become the enemy for so many people, which is tragic. Another tragic consequence of the invasion. But yeah, I mean, the EU has a European peace facility, which has been used to buy weapons, EU weapons. It has a European Defence Fund for the first time, which was never envisaged before. It's spending record numbers of military over the past number of years, and yet we've led to a situation of the biggest military conflict on the continent of Europe. So it's very clear that saying, oh, we need more security, we need more arms, we need more military, doesn't actually give you that. It gives the opposite. There was a really good Ukrainian peace activist, and I can't remember fully his slogan, but it was, if you prepare for war, you'll get war. If you want peace, you have to prepare for peace. And it does mean a return to dialogue. And I have to say, I've been bitterly disappointed by the role of the UN in this. The majority of the world's population live in countries who've been either at the receiving end of US militarism or who know the role of empire. And while they don't support the war in Ukraine, they kind of go, well, this is what the US have been doing for years. We're not going to overtly condemn Russia for that. Yeah, they shouldn't have done it, but the US have been doing it for years. So don't be so hypocritical about it. So they're the majority of the world's population. Their voice hasn't been heard. And my only hope is that actually that voice will register more. Maybe China, who again have been disappointingly quiet, they could play a role as well. They haven't yet. Maybe that will be the forum. But no, I don't believe the European army is the answer. I think it's the opposite. I think demilitarization is the opposite, but I'm not naive enough to think that that goal isn't further away than it was when I joined the European Parliament, because tragically it is, and we're living in frightening times on the continent of Europe for sure.
We are, and we are all hoping that it will not blow us up for good, which it still could. Thank you very much for fighting for demilitarization and for peace, even if it costs you a lot. You have all of my admiration, really, honestly.
Thanks very much, and thanks for the talk. It's so important that people have a space to tease out these ideas without demonization and vilification, and that's one of the real tragedies of the present situation. But the more I read about World War I, the more I kind of realize that they went through exactly the same thing, except they didn't have the menace of social media to get the message around and the hate around quicker.
Just unfortunately in Europe, we are not smart enough to learn from that. We keep trapping ourselves in the same mistake every other decade,
Yeah.
And I don't know
Yeah.
why. I try to understand it and I don't know. And it has nothing to do with democracy. We are just a very, very difficult continent.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, our vested interests are very skillful at exploiting it. Maybe that's another way. And it's the ordinary people who lose out all the time.
Yeah, so but we have to keep on. So I hope you can, and I wish you a good and safe drive back home, okay?
Thank you very much, Pascal. Thanks a million for having me on. Nice talking to you.
Thank you for
Bye-bye.
coming. Goodbye. Bye-bye.